What's going on, everybody? This is Naquanta, aka NKB, your fantasy guy for this NBA fantasy basketball season, and I am back with another video. And in this video, we are going to be talking about playoff schedules for your fantasy season. And I know we're just about a quarter way into the NBA season and the NBA fantasy season, but if you want to have the edge on your opponents when we get into the last weeks of the season, you should really start taking measures and start prepping yourselves right now in order to put yourself in a position to edge out your opponents. And the weeks that we are going to be talking about are weeks 21, which is the beginning of the fantasy playoffs, week 22, which will be the semifinals of the playoffs, and week 23, which is that championship week for most fantasy leagues. So without further ado, let's get into this video.
B.I.G.
Alrighty, so the advice in this video will be more geared towards players that are playing in head-to-head leagues, whether it be points or category leagues. And if you have been playing fantasy basketball for a while, or even if you're just now starting this year, by now you have realized that the amount of games played that your fantasy players play is the biggest determining factor whether you will beat your opponent that week or not. And that obviously means that you want the most games played during your fantasy playoff weeks in order to edge out your opponents. So we are just going to go over the amount of games played in weeks 21, 22, and 23 by each team. Knowing this information, you will be able to make trades or make waiver wire decisions on which players you want on your team in order to prep yourself for the fantasy playoffs. All right, so starting just this year, NBA teams will either play 3 games a week or 4 games a week. And in years past, teams would range between playing either 2 games to 5 games, which is really random and really inconsistent. And it really was a detriment to fantasy basketball players because, for instance, you could have a player only playing 2 games a week while your opponent had a player playing 5 games. And that was obviously unfair for your team, and you would not have a chance of winning that week because the opponent would obviously have more games played and more stats accumulated. So with the NBA pushing the start of the season up a week, that helped balance things out fantasy wise. They didn't do it because of fantasy, but it really helped fantasy players out just to keep things a little bit more even and a little bit more fair for head-to-head matchups. There are some advantages teams have or players have because, like I said, some teams either play 3 games a week or some teams play 4 games a week. So obviously if you have a player playing 4 games a week, you have the edge. So let's take a look at the last 3 weeks of the fantasy basketball season, which is the playoffs, and see which teams are playing the most games. So coming in at 12 games, which is the max amount of games that you can play in the fantasy playoffs, we have the Los Angeles Clippers playing 4 games all 3 weeks of the fantasy playoffs. Teams playing 11 games, we have the Charlotte Hornets, the Chicago Bulls, Cleveland Cavaliers, Detroit Pistons, Houston Rockets, Memphis Grizzlies, Milwaukee Bucks, Philly, Portland, Sacramento, and the San Antonio Spurs. Teams playing 10 games a week, which seems to be the most amount of teams. We have Atlanta, Brooklyn, Dallas, Denver, Golden State, the Los Angeles Lakers, Miami, Minnesota, the New Orleans Pelicans, New York Knicks, Oklahoma City, Phoenix, Toronto, Utah, and Washington. Now, the teams with the short end of the stick in the playoffs playing 9 games, which is the least amount of games that you can play within the last 3 weeks. We have Boston, Indiana, and Orlando. So those are the amount of games that each team is playing within the last 3 weeks. Now, an important note is that Toronto, even though they are playing 10 games, in week 21, they're playing 4 games. Week 22, they're playing 4 games, which is really good. But in the last week, week 23, which is the championship week, they're only playing 2 games. That is the only team that only has 2 games within those last 2 weeks. And it comes in the championship week, which is no bueno. So if you have DeMar DeRozan, Kyle Lowry, Serge Ibaka, or Jonas Valanciunas, one of those relevant players, any relevant players from the Toronto Raptors, I would look to move them before your trade deadline hits, because if you work really hard, if you work that hard to get to the championship and you are relying on one of those players and they're only playing 2 games a week, you will be very disappointed, because I mean, they're just not playing enough in order to help you out that week. So I would look to move them for equal value. If you get really close to the deadline, even if you have to trade them for a little bit less value, get a player that's playing 4 games in that championship week, I think you will hit on your investment on trading one of those players, because like I said, 2 games in the championship week, that is just, it's not a good look. So there you go, guys. I just wanted to make a quick video on fantasy basketball playoff schedules, just to get you all in the right mindset of prepping yourselves for those last 3 weeks of your season, and just to get yourself in a position to make the best run possible in order to win your fantasy championship. The important notes: LA Clippers, they have 12 games. If you don't have a Clipper on your team, or if you have pieces that you can trade for one of those guys like DeAndre Jordan or Blake Griffin, those are pretty much the only 2 relevant Clippers at the moment. I would look to trade for one of those guys because they have 4 games and will be very, very helpful for you. I will make a follow-up video a few weeks down the road, just to put it in you all's ear again, to make these trades before your deadline and just to get yourself a little bit more prepared. So again, if you're new to this channel, please subscribe. I really appreciate all the views and all the likes and all the comments that I get. If you have any questions, leave a comment, shoot me a message. I'll try to help you as best as I can, and I will see you all in the next video.